one here. So we have called this presentation seasonal garden transition, and really, it's you know getting rid of the spring garden and still working the garden in the heat of the summer while starting to make plans and transitional preparations for the fall garden. We kind of go from beautiful spring with tomatoes and zucchinis and cucumbers, and then we kind of think about just quitting the garden until we do the cool season, coal crops, etc. But there are quite a few crops that we can grow right through the heat of the summer that actually prefer the warmer weather that we're having now. So again, just real quick on this, we've got Peggy DeHemicourt, our programs director with Fort Bend County Master Gardeners, here today with us as our moderator, and Peggy will be responding to questions. So I ask here that through the presentation, especially since we have some embedded videos in the PowerPoint, it's paramount that everybody has their microphone turned off and their camera stream turned off during the presentation. And we ask you, questions, comments are all welcome, but we ask that you input those here into the chat box. You just click on this, the comment section will come here up on the right side. Just input your questions in there, and then Peggy will be wrangling those questions, and then throughout the presentation I'll ask her for which ones we think we need to address in a timely manner. As we get to the end of the program, if I don't ramble too long and we have some time left, I'll turn the presentation off, and we'll have some time for some open Q&A where we can go ahead and turn these microphones and video streams back on to allow a little bit more interaction between us. Okay, so until we get to that point, just go ahead and turn these off, and we'll take it from there. Let me check here real quick. Make sure got everybody. Okay, very good. Looks like we've got everybody's mics off. That's fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Real quick, Peggy, everything look good so far?
Looks good, Boone.
Okay, fantastic. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off there for now. Okay, so again, things that we're going to be covering today is just transitioning through the seasons in the garden, and not thinking that we have to just go from the bountiful spring garden straight to the fall garden when things cool off, but is that we can slowly move away from spring garden, get into the heat-loving plants, reap the benefit of the harvest of these things here before we start getting ready to go into the cool weather-loving plants. Things that we're going to be discussing here are going to be okra, the range of melons, sweet potato, southern peas, which if you're not familiar with the term southern peas, these include black-eyed peas, cream peas, Crowders, top picks, purple hull, pink eye, etc. Those all fall into the southern pea category, or what we would maybe call cowpeas. Peppers, and the eggplant. We'll get into just a little bit about how we can control pests, weeds, and disease as we get through the. I'm gonna go ahead and get him off here. Okay, good. Just continuing with weed, pests, and disease management as we move through the season. and then some ideas of transitioning into the fall garden. So this right here, what we're looking at is our Fort Bend County vegetable garden planting dates chart. And what we'll see on here, here's the range of all the different vegetable crops that we will grow throughout the year. And then we've got these lines here of red and green. Some of you have seen this. This may be new to some people, but to make it easy, the green represents the ideal planting times for each of these specific crops. An ideal suggests that this is the best time. We're going to get the most productivity if we can get up on the front side of this planting season and really take advantage of a longer growing time that's more conducive for that specific plant. The red here we call marginal, which means we can plant there, but we're not going to have the higher expectations as far as how long that plant is going to perform or how good our yield is going to be for that specific crop. And then also here, just to help you identify it, everything unless noted is seeds. So anything here that says crowns, plants, which are transplants, uh, starter plants, bulbs, etc. Anything else here, we're assuming we're planting seeds in the garden directly. Okay, so if you're like tomatoes here, right, it says plants, right? So we're not talking about seeds within this time frame. We're talking about putting in those little 4-inch transplants within these time frames here. Okay. You seen any comments on this, Peggy? Are we good?
We're good, Boone. No comments yet.
Okay, good. All right, so we're going to start here. I've just got a little bit of an introduction video for you. I'm going to mute. Howdy, folks. I'm here today in our Fort Bend County Master Gardener vegetable demonstration garden. And unfortunately, I'm here to showcase something maybe we don't want to do in the home garden. We've been without volunteers here for over 3 months, and we're in the peak of summer in Fort Bend County in southeast Texas. And this is what we end up with: weeds, lots of weeds, fast, furious. And once they get to this stage here, this is a lot of work for us. In midsummer, we're peaking about 100 degrees during the day. A lot of tough weeds in here. Got a big mound of fire ants here as well that I'm going to have to battle if I wanted to try to clean this up today. So I need to emphasize, probably more than anything, is as we're transitioning the garden from spring, summer, and into fall, is keep these weeds under control. A small amount of weeds in these beds is very easy for us to clean up as we start cultivating the ground and getting ready to plant for fall. So I'm not going to be able to teach a whole lot out of our gardens here right now, unfortunately. But I am going to take you to a couple of our Master Gardener volunteers' home gardens for you to see what we recommend. We're going to start off our first visit today is going to be at my friend Ken's garden. And Ken is going to give us a good overview of what he's doing and some practical ideas of how we can transition from spring into fall. Okay. Peggy, real quick, how'd that video play? You got your mic off again.
Yeah, thank you. It was a little bit jerky in terms of the visuals, but your voice was fine. We got the message loud and clear.
Okay, very good. Cool. Okay, so just real quick, emphasizing what we were seeing from this planting chart is that we have really 3 growing seasons here in Fort Bend County or southeast Texas, and we've got a range, and probably arguably our most productive season would be the cool season plants, and these are going to be a lot of our leafy green plants, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, spinach, etc. And then we've got our warm season, which could really arguably be 2 seasons. And these are going to be stuff like our squash and zucchinis and tomatoes, cucumbers. Really, the spring garden is this. And then we've got a small window of opportunity to do this in the fall, some of these same crops. And then we have, well, we don't even know what we call it. It's not warm season. It's more like this season. Um, it's hot. It's really hot. And so these are, stuff like tomatoes, stuff like cucumbers. When it gets this hot, those plants just shut down. They stop producing flowers. If they do produce flowers, they stop setting fruit, and they struggle to deal with the temperature, and we start having some plant stress issues, and then with plant stress comes disease issues and pest infestations. Um, so we're kind of transitioning from this warm season to this hot season, and then within that we've got a range of crops that we can grow as we're moving away from the spring stuff, getting into the peak of summer, so we're still being able to harvest some good stuff out of the garden. So within that, the first garden here that we're going to visit is going to be Ken, and he's got some really good ideas that I'd like to share with you, of kind of moving out from spring stuff and still having a fantastic abundance of harvest in the middle of summer. So I'm going to get this video going. Howdy. I'm here this evening in my friend Ken's vegetable garden, and I wanted to show you guys a couple things about just some transition in the garden and just some ideas to keep things moving throughout the year. What we see right here in front of us is a young watermelon crop. And as you can see, this is a young plant, young vines, very vigorous and healthy. Right behind us over here, we've got some old cucumber vines that are just about finished. So as they're moving out and being close to being ready to be removed, we've got another succession of plants right here ready to take over and push us longer through the summertime. Okay. So within that, there's some things that we need to be looking at. Let me go back here. Meet you there for a second. Okay, got a question. Okay, very good. Okay, so within that concept, we need to be thinking about this right here. And if you study concept of crop rotations, basically what we're wanting to do in our garden space, because we don't have acres of land to be moving things around in, but even within a small home garden, we need to be thinking about that as we're planting, that we're moving these plants into different beds in some type of a rotational transition, and that we're not constantly planting the same thing in the same spot. So what I'd want to avoid, so these are legumes. They're all in the same plant family. And these are all plants that tend to have the same types of insect and disease threats. So if I keep planting all the legumes in this bed, I'm going to start having some problems with insects and with disease pressure. It's going to continually mount. to the point where I have a really hard time growing these things. Same thing here. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, tomatillos, Irish potato. They're all in this solanaceous or nightshade family. So I don't want to keep planting those in the same spot. Onions, leeks, garlic. Okay, those are all in the allium family. Okay, those we want to move away from planting those in the same spot. Parsnips, carrots, same family. So be thinking about these things as we're moving these transitions in the garden. That if we're going to come in there with a different crop right after we've planted one as a transition crop, that it's not something that's going to suffer because we have some pressure from insects and disease in there. So always make a note to have some type of a guide like this. There's lots of different visuals, graphics that you can find out there that helps you kind of understand how to move those crops around. Do we have any questions on this one, Peggy?
No questions, Boone.
Fantastic. Oop. All right, here we go again. Here. I'm over here. I'm looking at another succession idea. There's 3 big rows out here in Ken's garden, and all this in spring was planted with sweet corn. Three rows, 2 double rows on each one here of sweet corn. And instead of ripping that up and cultivating the soil through there between growing seasons, just started planting for the summer right in that, just chopping off the base of the plants and seeding right into those beds without disturbing the soil. Over here in this one, we've got some small melons. And this one here, we've got some cow peas, southern pea, or black eye pea in this variety, purple hull peas, which this one right here is going to be one of my favorites for this time of year because it's going to grow thick. It's going to vine out. You're going to get a dense cover in this bed, which is going to keep the soil cool through the heat of the summertime. And it's really more of a good cover crop for us. Of course, it's a legume. So we're getting a little bit of nitrogen fixation in there naturally, adding organic matter, but just keeping that soil shaded, keeping the moisture intact, keeping the sun from hitting on top of that directly is worth just having some green here. But also, we get to harvest some southern peas off of that and have a good couple messes of black eyed peas over the summertime. So great idea. This bed here as well. We've got some young okra plants growing in this, but I'd like to show you real quick just what we're talking about. You can see the old corn stalks here that he just lined to use as a mulch along the sides of the bed, but we also have the plants here that were just cut off at ground level and just left in the ground and then planted and right down the middle in between those 2 rows. A nice healthy stand of okra that's just starting to put on some young pods inside of here. Further than that, and looking at the next step of succession, we've got some sweet potato slips that he's planted along the side here. So even as these okra plants start to grow up tall, which they will, we're going to get some ground cover underneath this with the sweet potatoes that's going to shade the soil. And then we're going to come out here in fall, and then we're going to pull up those sweet potatoes around winter, the first winter kill, the first frost that we get. Pretty cool. So a lot of ideas just in that one small space there, and just showing this garden is probably 20 by 40. It's a decent sized garden, but it's not huge by any means. But Ken's done a fantastic job with it of making the best use out of this space instead of coming in here and tilling this up, ripping everything out, tilling it up. He's got a lot of wood chips in between the rows. He's adding a lot of compost onto these beds and doing almost a no-till strategy, where if you can, if you keep, like this material, we probably want to rip all this out from this cucumber, because we may have some fungal or bacterial disease spores that may jump around. But once you get all that out and rake it up, you've got a pretty clean area underneath there that you can come up with a transition crop, and then mulch over these rows real well, so that we're avoiding any disease transmission, and then trying to keep these weeds under control. He didn't have hardly any weeds out in the garden because he uses such a thick mulch layer in between the rows. All right, what we've got here is another really cool idea of transitioning from the spring garden and going into summer. We've got some young melons here. These are muskmelon, cantaloupe, in this bed. And as you can see in here, we've got some onions. There's some white onions. There's some yellow onions in here. We've had some garlic earlier than that. And then earlier in the season, while it was still cool, Ken had some leaf lettuce growing in this bed. And so without doing any cultivation in here and disturbing the soil in between the seasons, I'm just keeping this succession going with the appropriate plants during the season. And then he's going to be able to push these melons here through the heat of the summer, and then we'll come back in here and look at doing some cool season crops. But probably little by little, he'll be pulling these onions out of here and getting those dried up in the house. So another cool creative idea of transitioning the garden. So pretty interesting there. I mean, from one season, from spring through summer and into fall, the potential for one row there to grow really 5 or 6 different crops in that one space is really taking advantage and maximizing the use of the square footage in that garden. Cantaloupes, what we grow down here are not true cantaloupes. They are a muskmelon here. But this is the time of year for us to be growing those to maximize the vine production, floral set, and fruiting before it gets too cold. They do love it hot, so we have to get them in the ground. If we haven't planted those yet, we need to get them in the ground real quick and get them moving before it starts cooling off. Because as the night temperatures start dropping down into the 60s, and definitely by the 50s, these plants really stop growing, and we're not gonna get the size or the number of melons out of these plants. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time today doing a deep dive into varieties or cultivars, but I will just note the importance of choosing the right plants, the right varieties that are proven for our area. And I'll take a second at the end to show you how to find a list of ideas of varieties for each of the plants that we're talking about. But we do have some picks here, and a lot of these picks are just their suitability for us, their disease tolerance. For the watermelon varieties, these are small varieties, small fruited varieties, and we grow those for several reasons. One, these big 15-pound watermelons, you got to have 6 people to eat them, but they take a long time to mature in the garden. These smaller varieties, that they don't take nearly as long to get a sizable fruit off of them. They make more fruit per plant, and so we can harvest those quicker and get them finished before we get into the cool season. Honeydew melons, good varieties, and we can also do some pumpkins now. Again, on the pumpkins, and I wouldn't be doing, winning the giant pumpkin award varieties right now, we would be looking at smaller pumpkins, or what we would call baking pumpkins, or there are some of the carving type, but there's the smaller ones, so that we can get this to a completed product before it gets cold. Again, as temperatures cool off in the fall, these plants really shut down. We need to have them already ready to harvest by then, or they just won't mature all the way for us. Let's see. I've got one last little video here I wanted to take in Ken's garden of this ancho chili pepper, and just a great example. We're right in the middle of July. It's the 18th maybe today. This is just on the edge of the hottest part of the summer in Southeast Texas, and this plant right here is just not slowing down. Um, I'm 5'8". This thing's topping out just about head height of me, and so we're maximizing the space here in the garden. If you've got a small space, you don't have a huge garden, this is like a small tree. If you look at the ground, it's not taking up any lateral space. So you could plant some other plants around here. If you had some small herbs, you could offset around the sides of this plant and then let this come up and really produce some shade for some of the other plants around there this time of year, which they may enjoy a little bit of shade during the middle of the heat of the day. But I could count probably 50 fruit on this. And the ancho is a New Mexico style chili. This is not really pungent. This is just going to be great for some real savory dishes in the middle of the summertime. Cool plant. Yeah, that one there, I just really wanted to brag on that plant. It was a beautiful plant, and I love those New Mexico style chilies, and they obviously enjoy the heat as well. So a plentiful harvest off of those plants. So again, here we've got the plants that we're talking about either working through right now or planting to try to take advantage of this peak of summer. Uh, these are all plants that love it hot, and we can get these in the ground now. Just a little TLC to get them started, because they can't. And within one day, if I put a 4-inch transplant in the ground, and if I neglect to water that plant one day, it could transpire. We've got today is supposed to be 100 degrees, feels like temperature of 110 for the next couple days. The relevant humidity is supposed to be pretty low, so that's going to make these dry out. So we got to, even though they like it hot, we got to make sure that we take care of them, nurture them while they're just getting established. Doesn't take them long to get established, but during that period, we do need to make sure that we get them off on the right start. Okay. Peggy, do we have any questions?
Do you know when Ken planted that pepper that you were talking about just now?
I have a pretty good idea of when he did. I probably bought that plant from the Fort Bend Master Gardener Spring Herb and Vegetable Sale back in March. So planting that then back in spring, they're slow to produce early on because it is a plant that does like it hot. And so, the temperate spring climate, that plant was probably spending most of its energy just growing. And then as it started getting warmer, produced fruit, and it's probably been producing fruit for going on about 3 months now, and it doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon.
That's great.
All right, here we go. Howdy. We're here at my friend Pam's house, and we're going to tour her fantastic vegetable garden to try to get some ideas on how we can transition from the spring garden and start getting ready for a fall garden here in Southeast Texas. So come on in, let's go take a look around. We're right here with Pam's okra bed, and I asked Pam here if she was providing okra for the U.S. military, and she giggled. But seriously, we've got enough space here, and we've planted enough okra to feed a whole community of people. So this is definitely something to be careful about when we're thinking about planting okra, is to plant what you need and what you're actually going to eat at home. What I tend to tell people is that 1 to 2 plants will feed one person in the household. Okay? 1 to 2 plants will feed one person in the household. Okay? So what that means is that I'm going out here in the summertime, every day you have to harvest okra, or else you're going to miss it and it's going to get too big. What do you mean too big? Too big means that if I come out and the pod is this size right here, I'm going to squeeze these ribs. And if I squeeze this and it feels like wood, it's hard and it doesn't budge, this pod is too far gone. I'm not going to be able to cook this down in the kitchen to something that we can eat. This pod is going to need to just be removed from here and discarded in the compost pile or elsewhere. Thing to look for here when I go out, we've got a full generation on this. I've got a full-size pod, I've got a young tender pod, and I've got some small ones here that are just getting started, okay? And so every day, this one here, if I squeeze it, it's still squishy. It's a little too big for my taste. I like them more succulent, but you could still harvest this one and eat it. This one right here, it's about 2 inches long, 3 inches long, real succulent, real squishy. This is the prime time pick for me personally. What this means here is that I've got to harvest this one today, and by tomorrow, this one right here, this little bitty nudge, is probably going to be about as big as this fingerling one here and be ready to harvest. So if we're continually staying on top of harvesting off the plant, it's going to keep producing more. If I leave these big pods on here and I don't pull them off, it's pulling energy away from the plant, so it's not going to be as vigorous at putting off new fruit. So I need to make sure I get these off the plant. So that's why it's important with okra every day. Go out there and harvest the fruit off of it. If there's old ones that are too woody, go ahead and cut those off the plant and discard them. And then these plants will keep producing all summer long.
Boone,
Yes, Peggy.
one of our participants is not seeing your videos and slides. She's just seeing your box, so to speak, with BH in the middle of her screen. Do you happen, I'm going to suggest she log on, back on. Do you have any other suggestions before she does that?
That's probably the best bet.
Oh, she just did it and she's back with us. Okay, press on.
And it's working?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Yep, sometimes technology just doesn't want to cooperate, but I'm glad it did in this case.
Good.
Now, what do we have here? Eggplant. Eggplant is one of those very controversial plants. Some people really like it, some people really don't like it. But nonetheless, it is a plant that really fits into the summer garden in Southeast Texas. Because as we can see here, it's brutally hot outside in the peak of summer, and these plants are producing fruit. Flowers, young fruit are developing right here all over these plants. So it is one that will produce a good yield all through the summer into fall. The other good thing about this plant is that it tends to grow up like a little tree. As you can see, as the plant gets taller, it starts to defoliate in the lower branches. And then you have most of the leaves growing up towards the top. So if we get a little creative, what we could think about doing in these beds here is we have all this open space, is we may be able to start planting our fall garden in this area just a little bit earlier than normal, because these plants here are throwing off a pretty good amount of shade to cool this soil and to keep this planting area a little bit more conducive for seed germination for tender, cool season, cool weather loving plants. Why not? Give it a try. As you can see here by the picture, there are lots and lots of different types, colors, textures within the family of eggplant. This is really just trial and error for you to figure out which ones you'd like. I tend to fall into the list of people that don't prefer eggplant. I think it's a texture thing in the fruit. But one thing to think about when we look at these varieties, I pulled these from two different A&M sites, which I can go through and show you how to access those. Of choosing the different varieties that we want. But at this time of the year, if we haven't planted these yet, this one is going to be probably the most important part, is this days to harvest interval. So when we plant these now, this is kind of the rough time frame before we're going to have a plant that starts having fruit that we can pull off. And since we are kind of teeter-tottering towards fall, right now we may want to look at some of these shorter varieties here so that we can get some fruit off the plants before it gets too cold. Because as the temperatures, again, as the night temperatures start cooling off, this particular plant is going to slow down on fruit development, flower set, and we're going to start decreasing our yields. So if we don't have them, if you're going to start them now, start with some of these ones that are have a shorter days to harvest interval. I'm here in Pam's garden taking a look at her pepper bed. Today is July 16th. We're nearing the hottest part of the summer in Southeast Texas. But yet these plants look fantastic. It's just a testimonial for peppers and their place in the spring, summer, and into fall gardens here in Texas, is that this is one that's just going to keep on going for us all through the summer. And you can see these peppers are loaded with fruit right now. One thing to consider is staying on top of harvesting the fruit. And I say that for multiple reasons. The longer that we leave fruit on these plants right now is draining energy from the plant. So you'll see some of the plants with a lot of fruit are going to start to show some symptoms of nutrient deficiencies, yellowing leaves, yellowing in between the veins of the leaves here. It's not going to have the growth and vigor that you would expect out of larger dark green leaves. And those plants are going to gradually start slowing down because they can't keep up with the energy loss of holding on to those fruit. So do your best to try to stay on top of harvesting and get those plants off there at a reasonable time frame. Other thing is that the longer we leave those fruit on the plants, we're going to start bringing in uninvited guests, varmin, birds, insects. I would expect to see some stink bugs. Here's a little leaf-footed bug right here. The more food source that they have constantly in this garden, you're going to get more and more insect pests are going to start accumulating into these beds, and the choices at that point are going to be either to go ahead and cut your losses, harvest what you can, remove those plants, or start looking at some insect control and some plant protection strategies of using pesticides, or simply coming out here in the morning and doing what I would call mechanical insect control.
Boone?
Yes, Peggy.
Tony would like to know, going back a topic, what is the name of the small round eggplant that was featured in your picture?
There are several varieties there. I believe that was one that's called 8-ball.
Did you say 8-ball, like the pool
Yep.
game? Okay. Thank you.
But when you're looking at for the seed varieties, you'll tend to see several of the smaller round ones that fit into that category, and those also tend to be the short length eggplant as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of different peppers out there. Any given harvest of something like a jalapeno here could provide a whole basket full of peppers. And so again, thinking about the size of the family, when we're looking at the number of plants that we're putting in the garden, either eating those fresh or figuring out ways for us to preserve that harvest for the rest of the year. Just know that we've got to keep pulling those off the plant, or else we're going to drain energy out of the plant and start inviting those pests to move into the garden. The leaf-footed stink bugs for us is probably the biggest threat for these. If we leave those fruit in there, those stink bugs really love. This is a preferable food. Anything that's succulent, juicy, sweet fruit that they can put their proboscis down into, they're going to feed on, and then they're going to start laying eggs, and then their nymphs are going to take over this and potentially get to a situation that is out of control. So if we keep the fruit off the plants, we're lessening that constant food source for those insects, and we're not going to have nearly the problems that we would have if we just neglected to harvest on a regular basis. Very important. A lot of different types of peppers for us, depending on your preference. There are some varieties of bells that are good for us. These are ones here that probably are best to get planted in spring while it's still cool, because these take quite some time. They're a large bush. It takes a long time for these larger fruit to develop. So going into fall, you may stay away from the bells because of the amount of time that we have. Banana peppers produce fairly quickly, and they produce an abundance of fruit. And then our hot peppers, a lot of variety here, and most of these are pretty quick to produce. The poblanos and the anchos, they do take a little bit longer because they are a little bit larger fruit. But your serranos, habaneros, Anaheim, jalapenos, chili piquins, etc. We could be planting those now, and we could be harvesting those before it gets cold out. So a lot of choices there. Mostly it's just on preference. I will just say here, this golden summer bell pepper, I would make a note of this one. We sold this year. This was a new variety for us, for the Fort Bend Master Gardeners, and I harvested a ton of fruit off of this one here. It alludes that it finishes as a golden color, yellow and then an orangey gold. But we harvested most of our fruit off of this as a green bell, harvested them a little early, and just hundreds, literally hundreds of fruit. And it's just about finished for us, but it's been a great performer. Hi. What I'd like to show you right here in this bed is a pretty cool idea of a seasonal transition garden. My friend Pam here, what she did, she had tomatoes growing in this bed in spring. Spaced out, you can kind of see the holes where the tomato plants were. But those plants are long gone now. We've gotten into the middle of the heat of summertime, and those are past production. What she did early on here that was pretty interesting is she went ahead and planted sweet potato slips in between those tomato plants. And while they don't really take off until it starts getting hot, they were able to root in and get started on their establishment. Just about the time that we're ready to pull out those tomato plants, these vines are starting to take off. I would imagine that within about 2 weeks' time from right now, this bed surface is going to be completely covered with sweet potato vines. And those do a lot of really good things for our soil. One, it shades the surface of the soil so that the surface doesn't dry out as much. Also, it protects it from direct heat exposure from sun. Also, you're going to see a little bit of weed pressure in here. That's going to diminish as the canopy of the sweet potato starts to fill over this bed. It's going to shade out any type of weeds that are in here and keep them weed free through the summertime. And as this grows and matures into fall, we'll be ready probably in October, November to come in here with the pitchfork, cut these tops off, and start digging sweet potatoes just about the right time to serve them with our Thanksgiving dinner. Okay, so with the sweet potato, we've got this tropical root crop that sprouts off of the underground tubers. There's several varieties that we have listed on the Aggie Horticulture website. But really, a lot of times this is just based off to what we can find. Certain nurseries, independent, family-owned retail nurseries will sell packs of slips, which is basically it's just the stem, long stem pieces that have been cut into sections, and then it's this slip piece that you plant in the ground here. If it's just a row garden, you plant these in there in these raised rows. If it's in a raised bed, basically just space them out about every 2 feet per slip and let those grow up from there. If you have a hard time finding these packs of slips in the garden center, we can simply just take one of the sweet potatoes that we could find from a farmer's market or grocery store, set that out on a damp piece of paper towel on a windowsill, spritz it with some water to try to encourage these eyes, right, to go ahead and sprout new shoots. And this is kind of what it's going to do. You're going to get a bunch of these shoots you're going to start taking off from the potato. And then once they thicken up like this here, they're fairly rigid, we can start cutting those off. And then at each of these little spots here, this is called a node. This is an inner node, the space between where the leaves grow. As long as we have 1, 2, 3 nodes on a piece, we can cut that. And then that's what we plant in the ground. And at each of these nodes, this is where roots are going to start developing. These are called adventitious roots. And then the roots are going to grow, and then we're going to get some new little buds grow out of here. here and here and start vining out from that. So lots of options, either purchasing from a nursery, um, just buying the potatoes, or you can keep an area in the garden where it's just kind of perennial. You just leave the potatoes in the ground all the time. And then as it resprouts the next year, is just use that as a propagation area to start pulling those slips from. Do we have any questions on this, Peggy?
Yes, we do. How many potatoes can you expect from one slip?
That's a good question. Depending on the depth of your garden, good loose, good deep loose soil. If you have clay, and we're not amending that clay soil, the subsoil very well, you're not going to see the yield, and you're not going to see the size of each of these tubers. So, a poorly prepared bed, you would maybe expect to have 7 or 8 small, thin tubers just fighting for some space to grow. If we have a sandy or sandy loam subsoil in a garden, we could expect to get a dozen or more fairly large tubers out of that. Or in a raised bed, if you have a 8, 10, 12-inch tall raised bed with a good friable, deep, well composted soil, it would be equivalent to a sandy loam profile, where you could get up to maybe a dozen very good sized tubers from each plant. Okay, so that's kind of the summer stuff, the real stuff that's either planted now or we have an opportunity to plant real quickly. And then these are these transitional crops here, okay, which would be a lot similar to our spring garden, that we're going to try to get another wave of these things before we start planting our cool season crops, our cool weather loving plants. The multiplying onions, which we just buy small planted stock of these, or a lot of times we tend to know somebody who has multiplying onions because they never go away and they continually multiply. Um, Bush beans, cucumbers, summer squash, which is like our yellow crookneck, and our zucchinis, and then a small variety of tomatoes. What I'd like to talk to you about briefly here is bed transition. This bed right here was a tomato bed. As you can see, we've got our last standing tomato plant here. There's just a couple fruit left on there that she's letting ripen up, and then this guy is going to get out of here. And then she's going to remove the rest of these cages and get this bed prepped for fall. Now, what's one thing, real quickly, that we don't see in these beds? Weeds. There's no weeds in here, okay? So she's done a fantastic job of just seasonal weeding. And then as we've pulled these plants up, it's coming in here and removing all the live vegetation, getting all that weed pressure out of the way. Now, at some point soon, we're going to want to do something to this bed to keep it weed-free for about a month until we get ready to plant our fall garden in mid-August. And so you have options there. Is one, you can do a very quick live cover crop, some legumes, some cowpeas. There's some different types of annual grasses that we can plant in here. Sun hemp is another legume that's great. We've got a very short window there, so that's going to be iffy. Probably more honest within a 1 month time frame would be for us to just cover this ground with some pine straw, with some alfalfa hay, or if we have access to hardwood leaves, we can just pile on these beds about 6 inches thick to discourage weeds from germinating until we're ready to come in here in August to start planting our fall garden. Any questions on this one, Peggy?
Not yet on the weed management and bed prep, but there was a question about the previous slide about things to plant in August. The question was, do we mean planting from seed or planting seedlings? And I started to respond by saying it depends. Would you like to address that a little more?
On which specific crop?
The slide prior to this one where you had things to plant in August. There you go.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I was saying, well, beans we would plant by seed, and that's where I stopped.
Okay, very good. I'm going to go through all these individually here, so we will get that question answered for sure.
Good. We can wait.
So let's see.
Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to emphasize on this is just we see all this just bare soil. You see my cursor moving around?
Mm-hmm.
We want to, I mean, kudos to Pam for not having weeds in the garden, which is one of the best things, just to not allow the weeds to ever get started in the first place. But what we want to do is not have this soil just bare for a long time before she starts planting in here. Um, like we're not going to do tomatoes in here because we don't want, we've got, old dead fruit, leaves that could spread disease, but we're probably going to prepare this for the cool season garden at some point, but that's not quite yet. We got to wait a little bit longer. So we want to cover this up, and I tend to like pine straw, pine needles, because they do break down easily within time. Some people look like alfalfa, hay in here, or just leaves from the yard. It would be a good choice as well. There's something to cover this up so that the soil is not just cooking on the surface. We're going to get some compaction in here, and we're going to end up losing some organic matter because of the soil getting so hot. Saw a good video from our friend Farmer Al this week on Facebook where he was putting a temperature probe into just some exposed soil during the hot summer sun, and we're getting up to 110, potentially up to 120 degrees. Just by having the sun directly hitting the soil. So covering that with a mulch or a temporary cover crop is a fantastic idea.
Boone?
Yes, Peggy.
Tony's asked about other covers, such as grass clippings or plastic to serve a purpose. And then Renee'd like to know if we can recommend sources for alfalfa hay.
Very good. So for alfalfa hay, sometimes some of the independent nurseries carry those, but that is something that you would find at an ag farm center. And driving different directions in Fort Bend County, we do have several farm and ranch supply businesses, and they have what they would call small square bales of alfalfa hay. It's actually used for specialty feed for livestock, but it does make a fantastic mulch. The pine straw, if you don't have pine trees in your neighborhood, some of the nurseries do carry those in square bales as well. They're fairly affordable, and you just open them up and spread them out. As far as grass clippings as a mulch, there's several things to be aware of. There is that even if we do a very good job of managing our turf. More than likely, there's probably some weeds in there, and we're cutting off the tops of the plant, which may include seeds, developing seeds, or propagules from certain weeds, like Virginia buttonweed, for instance. If you cut that and bag it and put it as a mulch, there's a pretty good chance that those propagules, the stem, is going to root into your garden and end up causing you some problems. So one is weeds, maybe in the turf grass for grass clippings, and two, if we've used any type of a herbicide, a weed killer in the grass, then there's a chance that we could bring some of that residue into our planting beds that's going to end up negatively impacting our plants. You know, when we use herbicides, we're typically killing broadleaf weeds. Then we put those clippings in a bed where we're growing broadleaf plants. That math just doesn't add up right. So typically want to avoid that unless you know, one, you don't have weeds, or two, you haven't used herbicides. And typically those two things go hand in hand. So I usually do not advise it. When we get into plastic row covers, a couple things to think about. If we use a clear row cover, we're going to kind of cook the top layer of soil because it does raise the temperature, which is actually a practice if we're trying to get rid of certain disease pressure in the soil or certain weeds, noxious weeds. We can kind of cook or solarize the soil, but that's not what we're wanting to do. We're wanting to keep the soil shaded and cool so that we preserve the organic matter and the organic life that's in our topsoil that is helping our garden grow. A black row cover or black row fabric, it might not be a bad idea if you can find a large enough section of it, large enough that would cover the whole garden. Because if you have splices between those pieces of plastic or fabric, a lot of times you'll end up getting a little area in between those where it's advantageous for weeds to grow, and you end up with some problems there. But black row fabric would and could work if you wanted to do that as an option. Peggy, do you think that answers the question?
I do.
Okay.
And Boone, there's another question, which I believe you've covered, but maybe not exactly as asked, whether one can succeed in planting watermelons from seeds in August.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and again, that goes back to the variety selection. We need to start those plants now. We need to irrigate them and fertilize them properly. For a watermelon uses a lot of fertilizer, a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. And despite the fact that they are known for being drought resistant, they, as the plants are developing and the fruit are developing, they do depend on quite a bit of water. Drip irrigation in those beds is going to be necessary, and regular applications of fertilizer to get those plants up and growing, vining out, producing flowers, fruit, and then harvesting the fruit before it gets cold. Once the temperatures start dropping, particularly the night temperature is what we're looking at there, those types of plants start really slowing down. And when we get into shorter days, they start slowing down. So we'd have to really jump on it, get those plants up and running before we run out of the suitable weather for their growth. All right, so again here, the multiplying onions. A lot of times, you you'll just find somebody that you know that has a bunch of these in their garden, and they'll give you a little bunch of them to get started with, and then they will slowly take over the whole garden. But some varieties you might see if you go to a feed store or to a garden center would be these right here. Or a lot of times, this isn't that common of a plant for us. Sometimes the label is just going to even say multiplying onion, and we're just going to be happy with that. But know that when we plant that, that's a perennial onion, and that it's constantly just breaking apart and dividing itself into smaller bulbils or offsets. And if everything else is conducive for growth in the soil, it just keeps growing and reproducing for us. And this is one that we really just use for kind of shallots or for green onions. These are hollow stems in here, so you want to harvest the younger leaf stems on here to have a little bit more palatability. As these older leaves get large, there's more cellulose, lignin in this, and those become a little tougher to eat, but a good choice. For our summer squash, again, this is one that preferably spring is going to give us the longer season, but we can run another season of these. The idea again is to get your plants off the ground quickly. We do plant these from seed. They're very vigorous. You get them in the ground from seed. They germinate within a couple days typically, and before you know it, they are up and flowering and fruiting. But we need to do it quick, because as it starts getting cooler, these are going to slow down on us. Other thing for us to be thinking about is the later season for these, we're going to have more pest and disease pressure. Two issues with these are squash vine borers and powdery mildew disease. Powdery mildew is this white, dried, milky look to the tops of the leaves, and the squash vine borers basically bore their way into the vine, and the plant just starts wilting and then just collapses. And both of those pressures are much more later in the season because they've been active all year. And so a couple things to be careful about is that we don't plant these where we planted them in spring. Move them somewhere else in the garden to avoid, if you had some powdery mildew spores in the soil and we get rain and it splashes up on the leaf, you're going to get it real quick. But if we move it somewhere where we haven't planted squash, then that's going to take a little bit longer before it becomes a problem. Some of the varieties here for summer, your zucchinis, your crookneck, yellow straight neck, and then this one here, tatume, is a pretty good idea, specifically for people who have had reoccurring problems with squash vine borers. Because this is a vine that's very aggressive, as it moves around, it produces roots. If the nodes of the vine touch the ground, it likes to produce adventitious roots that root in to the soil. So as it moves around the garden, it's got all these rooting points. So if you end up having a squash vine borer that impacts one section of that plant, there's a good chance it's not going to infiltrate the rest of the plant. And so you still end up with a plant that's going to produce flowers and fruit. Even though it may be impacted by the borer, it can still continue growing. Where these here are traditional summer squash. When we get borers in those vines, there's just one vine. and one rooting location, and they tend to be done. It tends to be the end of the deal for us. So something that might be worth researching. Similar texture and taste, but just a different growing plant. And it's going to cover more area in the garden. So where these ones take up an area of maybe a 2 foot by 2 foot space, you may give these guys their whole bed to grow in. Beans, very short season to try to do green beans. In the fall, again, spring is our optimum planting time for green beans, but we can try to get a smaller crop. I would look at doing bush types if we're going to be planting those now, because the pole types, they spend a lot more time early on vining. When we say bush, this grows upright into a small determinate size. The pole is vining or more indeterminate. It just likes to spread out everywhere. So basically with this, the plant's gonna take more time early on producing those vines. Where the bush type is gonna come up, it's gonna form a little bush and it's gonna start flowering quicker. So I would prefer to do bush types in fall. Any questions, Peg?
No, Boone.
Okay, fantastic. Cucumber as well, not nearly the length of season or the preferred season, but we can try to do a smaller cucumber crop going into the fall. Again, the one thing to think about is that we're not planting your fall cucumbers in the same spot that we had them in spring, because more than likely we've got some spores from some potential diseases in here. We've got the eggs or nymphs of some of these specific pests in this spot. So we would try to identify an area somewhere else in the garden to plant these. We do need some trellising. Here's just some welded wire. It doesn't have to be anything fancy because the cucumber vines are very aggressive. They do have these little running tendrils, modified leaves that will find their way up very quickly and cover your trellis. Just need something there for them to grab a hold of. When we look at varieties on cucumbers, again, not going to go into a whole lot as far as variety selection, but just know what you want. Picklers are pickling type. It's a different look and it's a different texture within the fruit that is better for the final product if we want pickles. For slicers, these ones here, the burpless varieties, tend to be more crisp and better quality for us to do for fresh slicing for salads, etc. So just know what you want as far as the food, and then picking the right variety to make sure that you get that. Tomatoes, we can do another crop of tomatoes. We need to get those plants. Let me back up. Seeds, 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 plants. Okay, so we're starting with these little plants with the multiplying onions. For squash, direct seeding. Beans, direct seeding. Cucumbers, direct seeding. These germinate very quick in the ground. But tomatoes, definitely we want transplants. Typically you're going to find these in a 4-inch transplant container. If you can find them in a little bit larger, like a 6-inch round container, the more, especially for fall, the more developed plant we can start with, the better off we're going to be to make sure that we get to this point before it gets cold outside. So, a couple things to think about is the length of season. Okay, here's a bed here that's pretty typical for us. We don't want anything bigger than this height for fall, and so we're going to prioritize using bush varieties. With tomatoes on the label, if you're not sure of it, it's going to say indeterminate, or it's going to say determinate, or it's going to say bush on it. That we don't want this crazy tall plant. If we're doing what would be like a celebrity or an early girl type variety, we want to be able to come in here and just harvest those off of a plant that's a manageable size. But when we get into all these little cherry types, most of these are going to be indeterminate, which is your vining types, which are going to get bigger. And so you have to prepare for that with some type of a trellising, because they are going to get large and wild and out of control. But those ones, the good thing about the indeterminate for this time of year, which is, like I said, most of the smaller grape, cherry, pear varieties, is that they just keep producing. As they produce more plant, they produce more flowers and then more fruit. That's really good if we start off with a mild fall, because these can keep growing really all the way until we get our first killing frost. Sometimes that's in November, but most of the time that's in December. But if we're just lucky that it doesn't really get super cold below freezing, for a whole night, that we can keep pushing these plants until we get to that point, and then we can end up harvesting a pretty good amount of fruit off of these small varieties going way late into the year. But if you want these, mid-sized slicer type tomatoes, you're going to want to use these short harvest interval varieties like Early Girl or Celebrity to get those. And then also paste type tomatoes such as Roma, we can do those now. And then you can make certain types of pastes, salsas, and marinaras. Can those over the winter. So a lot of options here on tomatoes, but the things to remember is that we have a very short window of opportunity. So we get the soil prepared, we get those transplants in the ground, we water them appropriately, we add fertilizer to them regularly because they are high users of nutrients. This is what we want. We want this canopy as quick as possible to be able to have them produce flowers as it cools off a little bit, probably starting 1st of September. As the night temperatures cool off, these are going to start flowering and then start producing fruit. They're not going to produce fruit yet because it's just too hot. They don't set right now. But we want this big plant when those temperatures start, so that the plant is big enough and it's ready to start producing flowers and setting fruit and growing fruit on the plant, so that we can get them developed and get them off the plant before it gets cold and we don't end up having to eat a whole lot of fried green tomatoes. Okay.
Couple of questions.
Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you top off the larger plants, the tomato plants, to achieve the bush size that you're talking about? And are tortillas only for spring planting?
What was the second one?
Are tomatillas
Okay.
only for spring planting?
Very good. Um, to be honest with you, I haven't tried tomatillos in the fall. I don't see why it wouldn't work. They're a pretty quick growing plant. Uh, the thing to think about there is they tend to grow, size up, and produce fruit pretty quickly. Like in the spring garden, most of the tomatillos are almost finished up by the time your tomatoes and peppers and so forth are even getting started. Um, so I would say give it a try. I just don't have a whole lot to support the fall planting of those. Typically for us, we recommend a mid spring planting of those, and then getting the fruits off of those as it starts getting hot. The question about topping tomatoes, um, typically it's not a good idea. The more we start having to mess with these plants, um, it's going to slow them down. They're going to get stressed. So it's if you're worried about size, you gotta look for the determinate or the bush types, so that we're not having to sit there and prune and cut away at the plants to keep them to the size we want. The determinate varieties produce a determinate size of plant. They're small. They stay in the same spot. They stay to a nice shape. They hardly need any trellising on their own, just to keep the plant from falling over at times. Um, but I would choose the variety instead of pruning on the plant. When you start looking at catalogs and seed packs, etc., there are some that are labeled patio, and that just alludes to the fact that this is a dwarf variety. So that not only are they determinate or a bush, but they're a plant that has been bred to be a small size at maturity if you're trying to fit those into a small spot. There's a second part to that question, and I don't know if it was intended, but I'd like to dive into it. And this is where we've planted tomatoes in spring, and then those plants are still there now. We get a lot of questions on whether or not I can trim those plants back and then try to reinvigorate them to reproduce again for fall. And I wouldn't just completely knock that down, because I have heard of people having success doing that, but my recommendation is not to do that. And the reasons for that is because those plants have suffered through summer, and with that comes a whole lot of environmental pressure in the form of insects, diseases, root knot nematodes, can have invaded the root system. So we're typically, even though the plant's alive, it's been exposed to a whole lot of environmental pressure that's going to impact the vigor of that plant going into fall. So we're kind of nurturing this thing back to health instead of starting with a new plant that's grown from, in a greenhouse, that's vigorous, that's disease and insect free. It's going to establish itself very quickly. It's going to put on a lot of growth, and it's going to give us our desired outcome, versus a plant that we have kind of nursed back to health. We're never really sure if that's going to amount to anything for us as far as fruit harvests at the end of the year. You have more questions, Peggy?
No more questions. And I'm feedbacking through your computer, Boone. Yeah. But Tony reported that his tomatillos have been producing and are still producing since the spring planting. So that's good.
That is fantastic. Well, we'll see. I'm going to turn off the presentation and just kind of guide to a couple sites here real quickly before we finish up. First one, the Aggie Horticulture website is probably the one I'll show you the most of. Soil testing, this is one that we tend to cover and nearly every presentation is, we recommend for a homeowner, every 2 to 3 years is to have your soil tested to test for nutrient levels. And so we can adjust our fertility based off of a report instead of kind of what we would assume. We tend to make fertilizer mistakes unless we really know what the soil needs. The plant clinic, as well as in College Station, if we're dealing with reoccurring disease issues that we're not sure of what's going on, you can send samples of those plants to the diagnostic lab to be analyzed for disease potential. For the Fort Bend Master Gardener website always is full of awesome information. We've got a new platform for that, so there's a lot of education built into it. And then our AgriLife Extension website here for Fort Bend County really just lets you know who we are. We've got 12 agents and supporting program staff here in the office, and all the other things that we do here in Fort Bend County with the extension. So I'm going to close the presentation real quick and see if I'm guessing I'm still sharing my screen.
Yes, you are.
Okay, fantastic. So all I had to do there was just type the word Aggie, and then it just kind of populated. But if you just did a Google search for Aggie horticulture, this will always be the top result. Click on the website here, and this is everything that we have to offer from Texas A&M horticulture department, including our extension horticulture division. So lots of different categories in here, everything that we're working on horticulturally, but most relevant for us is going to be there's a vegetable resources tab, and a couple of things here for us to utilize the most are going to be these two right here. These easy gardening fact sheets. These are PDF publications over every one of our suitable vegetable crops for Texas. And each one of these goes, about 3 or 4 pages into everything we would want to think about for that particular crop, including variety selections, when to plant, what to expect as far as insect and disease pressure, fertilization, harvesting, etc. So we've got all that here. If you're thinking about a new crop, I would recommend opening those up and reading through those to give you an idea of what you're getting yourself into. As far as variety recommendations, like I had mentioned, this is not the end all, but we're going to have some varieties in here if you're just getting started. For us, we're in Southeast Texas, Region G. When I click on that, I can go here and I can pick a variety or a type of vegetable, broccoli, and then hit select, and it's going to give me a listing of some different recommendations as far as broccoli. And again, here we have this days to harvest interval. So if we're thinking about a short season like this green comment, I could plant that early in the fall, and I'm going to have broccoli by December. Some of these longer type varieties here, if I plant those now, I'm probably not going to see this harvest until late winter, after the temperatures start warm up. So you can kind of choose the variety on how quick or how delayed you want to have that garden last. So I could go, so within this, I could search all vegetables. If I wasn't really sure what I was looking for. And then this just pulls up each type of vegetable and then the coordinated varieties for us here in Southeast Texas. So pretty cool tool there for people who are struggling to find the appropriate varieties. The problems that we get into without utilizing these things that we've created is that if you just go to the box stores, etc., and they've got these shimmering seas of seed packets, those are the same seed packets and varieties that have gone to Oregon and Maine and Missouri or Missouri, um, versus varieties that we know through trials that do well here in Texas, that are specific to us here in Texas. So either this or contacting your master gardener hotline, and then they can offer up varieties beyond these that we may have tested here locally for your use. So soil testing said, so this is the website for the Soil and Water Testing Laboratory in College Station. And so we can do submittal forms. And then for us, it's going to be this urban soil submittal form. And then from that, we fill out all the information here, what we're trying to test for. Our requested analysis here is going to be for vegetable garden. So we put in D in here. And then the instructions on how to take the sample, to collect it, and to mail it are all on the back page, including the address for the laboratory. And then they will email you your soil results and recommendations on how to adjust the fertility once it's completed. So again, for a homeowner garden, I tend to recommend that you do this every 2 or 3 years, just so that you can adjust your fertilization based off of something real, instead of us just kind of throwing a generic fertilizer at that soil and maybe starting to skew our nutrient levels. So similar to that, our plant disease diagnostic lab, if you've got plants that are reoccurring, having disease or death, necrosis, etc. Similar to that, we can take a part of the plant. You have a general diagnostic form, which is your routine diagnostic form here. And similar to the soil and water testing laboratory, we will fill out our information, what we're testing for, and we're going to sign this here, and they're going to test that for you on the back page as well. It gives you the instructions for collecting, packaging, and submitting the samples to the lab, and then they will email you a response and a recommendation on how to move forward with the problem. So pretty nice resource there. And of course, our fantastic Fort Bend County Master Gardeners website here has been rebuilt this last year and has a lot of resources built into it. Our public events, which unfortunately due to COVID-19 has not been very extensive, but as we get back to normal, look this up here for information on programs that we're doing. We do have see lots of different publications, etc., updates, and for other information on extension. And then here, how to become a master gardener. We have our fall training. We are going to be conducting that online, so that'll be pretty cool for us. Oops. Contact, and if you just have questions that you have, you can submit those questions here, and we've got wranglers that will respond to those questions. Or if you just want to give us a call, you can call the number here, and then you can talk to one of our Master Gardener question wranglers. We'll get you taken care of. Got an email address down here as well. If you want to just email them directly, we can do that. Our offices here, unfortunately, now are limited to direct contact, so this would be a great place for you to get started on getting those questions answered.